morning ballistic missile from Iran with cluster bumps hit directly this kindergarten center in Iran. No casualties.
The United States, the Trump administration, the president, all insisting that there are negotiations well underway, but Iran flatly dismissing that outright and even rejecting that 15-point plan that the United States sent by way of Pakistan to end the war. Iran's foreign.
Since the start of this war, dozens of ballistic missiles carrying cluster warheads have penetrated Israeli airspace and struck urban centers.
What you just watched was the public version of the story. The part that matters more begins after the clips, because the real breach here was not only where something landed, but what repeated salvos did to the idea that the quiet in between still meant safety. Start in the room, not on the map. A cluster bomb flew through the ceiling of an elderly couple's apartment in central Israel and exploded in their tiny living room. And in that instant, the war stopped being a clean argument about radar, batteries, and interception percentages. It became a hole in a ceiling, ash across furniture, a couple who never made it through the night, and the brutal truth that even in a defended country, one surviving piece of one missile can still find the slowest body, the weakest door, the one room where timing runs out. That is the layer beneath the clips. The footage showed a strike. This scene shows what a cluster warhead actually does to the promise people thought the shield above them was making, then locked the title into place exactly where it belongs. Iran fired 7 salvos at Israel within hours after a 14-hour lull, and 9 people were injured across Israel and the West Bank. Which means this was never just one impact, or one frightening clip. It was a sequence, a morning broken into waves. Kafr Qasim, Tel Aviv, the north. The West Bank, more shelter runs, more sirens, more seconds where people had to decide whether the last interception had really ended anything. The title works because the pressure was cumulative. By the time a population hears the 3rd warning, then the 5th, then the 7th, the target is no longer just a city block. The target is the public's sense of time, the body's ability to come down from alarm, the belief that the gap between attacks is still a form of protection. That is why the injury count in the title is not the whole point. Reuters reported that Israel failed to intercept one of the cluster missiles overnight, and that its small bomblets scattered into civilian areas in Tel Aviv. And that changes the meaning of what the audience thinks it clicked on. This is not just Iran fired again. This is Iran kept enough of a launch alive long enough for one missile to stop being one threat at all. Once the carrier survives to the wrong point in the sky, the strike stops feeling singular. It becomes a spreading civilian event, a field of impacts, a wider radius of fear, and a much harsher psychological message than the raw number 9 can carry on its own. And that is where the title gets its teeth. The kindergarten clip is not just dramatic footage. It is proof that once cluster munitions enter the story, protected civilian space starts shrinking in the public imagination. A kindergarten in central Israel becomes part of the same battlefield as missile launchers, interceptor batteries, and diplomatic statements, and that is exactly the kind of detail that makes people click a title like this right now. They are not asking whether missiles were fired. They already assume that. They are asking whether the war has entered a phase where everyday places now feel one layer closer to the blast pattern. The answer in this sequence was yes, and that is why this headline feels so much heavier than the casualty figure alone. If you want this war covered at the level where the footage stops and the real implications begin, subscribe now and tell me where you're watching from. Because the same headline looks very different depending on whether you're reading it over coffee or timing your life between alarms. What the audience came here for is simple, and the answer has to be just as simple. Did Iran just prove it can still punch through the feeling of Israeli defensive control? Even after weeks of US-Israeli strikes on Iranian launchers and infrastructure? That is the question carrying this entire video. Because if the answer is yes, then the story is not 9 injuries. The story is that one surviving launch can still buy far more instability than its numbers suggest. Here is the mechanism that turns the headline from news into strategy. Reuters reported that these warheads break apart at an altitude of 710 kilometers above the ground, creating dozens of separate impact sites. Which means the decisive moment is no longer just whether the missile is intercepted, but when. Hit it early enough, and you may kill the carrier. Miss that window and the battlefield changes shape above the city itself. One incoming object becomes multiple falling dangers spread across a wide area. And with that one shift, the defender is no longer fighting a neat terminal problem. It is fighting fragmentation, dispersal, and a public that hears the word intercepted, but still sees damage turning up in too many places at once. That is why this tactic is psychologically violent, even when the casualty count stays below what audiences expect from a war headline. It does not need to kill dozens every time. It needs to make the sky feel untrustworthy. It needs to turn a defended city into a place where the siren is only the beginning of the question, not the answer. And then comes the coldest intelligence finding in this entire story. There are times when the Israeli Air Force chooses not to shoot down all or some of the bomblets to conserve its stockpile of short-range interceptors, which means the real contest here may not be whether Iran can destroy the shield, but whether it can force decisions inside it. That is a much more dangerous idea than the dramatic fantasy of a total breakthrough. It means a defender can still be functioning, still be imposing heavy interception rates, still be militarily ahead, and yet civilians below may still be living with the consequences of what commanders decide is not worth spending premium defensive ammunition on once the cluster effect has already begun. That single detail changes the way the audience should understand the phrase, 7 salvos. These were not just 7 attempts to hit, they were 7 opportunities to force the defender into repeated economic, tactical, and psychological calculations. Every wave asks the same brutal question. How much defensive certainty can be purchased? And at what cost? Before the shield starts protecting the state more cleanly, on paper, than it protects daily life on the ground. And if anyone wants to dismiss this as a freak morning, the pattern says otherwise. The Guardian reviewed the impact of dozens of Iranian strikes, alongside Israeli statements, and identified at least 19 ballistic missiles carrying cluster warheads that penetrated Israeli airspace and struck urban areas since the beginning of the war. That means March 26 was not important because it was unique. It was important because it made the pattern impossible to ignore. At least 19 penetrations into urban areas is not background noise. It is evidence that cluster dispersal has become one of the most effective ways for Tehran to turn residual missile capability into civilian pressure. And that is exactly the kind of battlefield adaptation governments talk around when they want to sound more in control than the evidence feels. And when that pattern is translated into human terms, the story gets harder, not softer. A worker from China was killed, and another seriously injured by shrapnel from a missile with a cluster bomb warhead at a construction site in Yehud. And that detail should sit in the viewer's mind longer than any official slogan. Because cluster warheads erase the fantasy that the front mind stays somewhere else. A construction site becomes part of the same strategic story as an air defense battery, a cabinet briefing, and an international ceasefire proposal. That is what makes this weapon choice so effective at producing fear far beyond the raw blast radius. It drags ordinary places into a war logic they never volunteered to join. Now the information war has to be read properly or this entire video collapses back into TB news. Israel's narrative is that Iran is using inherently indiscriminate cluster effects over civilian population centers and proving criminal intent. Iran's narrative is built around endurance, retaliation, and the message that even after weeks of joint pressure, Israeli civilians still feel the war at home. Both sides gain from their version. Israel gains legitimacy for harder strikes. Iran gains proof of relevance. And the evidence in front of us suggests both are leaning on truths that help them, while hiding the part that hurts them most. For Israel, the part that hurts is obvious. Even with high interception rates and serious damage inflicted on Iran's military infrastructure, enough is still getting through to keep civilian insecurity alive. For Iran, the part that hurts is just as obvious. The need to rely on this kind of pressure reveals a force under attritional stress, one whose remaining capability may matter more politically than it does militarily. But wars do not end on military arithmetic alone. They often end when political time starts breaking faster than physical stockpiles. That is why the diplomatic clip mattered so much. Publicly, there were claims that negotiations were well underway, but Iran flatly dismissed that and rejected the 5-point plan sent through Pakistan, which tells you the missile salvos and the diplomacy were not separate stories. They were one signal delivered to 2 channels at once. Tehran was saying, do not confuse reduced tempo with surrender. Do not confuse battlefield damage with obedience. And do not assume we will stop just because Washington wants a cleaner end state than the one unfolding in real time. And once that message lands, the title opens up another layer. Iran fired 7 missile salvos at Israel in hours is not only about military persistence, it is about negotiating leverage. Every fresh wave tells mediators, allies, markets, and domestic audiences that the war has not yet been forced into a neat shape. Every shelter run keeps that point alive. Every cluster-related impact tells both camps that the cost of waiting has not disappeared. Then the blast radius widens beyond Israel entirely. AP tied the war to Brent crude topping $100 a barrel as Iran attacked shipping, and that matters because Tehran is not only trying to injure people in Israeli cities, it is trying to make itself impossible to isolate inside one battlefield. The missile salvo, the oil price, the shipping lane, the Gulf anxiety, the pressure on Washington's timetable, all of it forms one coercive architecture. If Iran cannot win cleanly in conventional terms, it can still try to make the regional and economic consequences of the war messy enough that everyone else starts asking how much longer this can continue before the damage spreads into other strategic compartments. That is where the script has to get harder, because this is where most coverage goes soft. A lot of people will watch the footage, hear that 9 were injured, hear that most missiles were intercepted, and conclude the system held. That is too shallow. The deeper conclusion is that the system held enough to prevent catastrophe, but not enough to preserve the old emotional contract under which most intercepted automatically translated into public reassurance. Cluster warheads are dangerous precisely because they attack that contract. They turn successful defense into an argument over how much insecurity is still considered acceptable, and that is why the audience clicked. Not for a lecture on munitions law, not for a generic update that both sides are still trading fire. The audience clicked because it sensed that 7 salvos in hours and cluster warheads injuring 9 sounded like more than another headline. It sounded like a shift, a test, a clue that the war was mutating from simple exchange into something more psychologically corrosive. If Israel's public case is broadly true, and Iranian launch capacity has been heavily degraded, then this is still a serious warning. It means a damaged missile force can remain strategically dangerous if it chooses the right delivery method and keeps enough precision in its political signaling. It means the last dangerous phase of a wounded arsenal can still be bloody, destabilizing, and effective at extending uncertainty far beyond the number of people directly hit in any one morning. If, on the other hand, Israeli public progress claims are overstated, then the warning gets darker. Then these 7 salvos are not just the reflex of a damaged force. They are proof that Tehran has more room than advertised to keep puncturing Israel's defensive advantage and to keep shaping the timing of any eventual ceasefire through repeated civilian pressure. Either way, the strategic conclusion survives. Either way, the title remains bigger than the body count, because the real weapon here was not just the missile, it was the tempo. 7 salvos in hours means the quiet itself became untrustworthy, and once the quiet becomes untrustworthy, public resilience starts draining in ways military briefings almost never measure honestly. So here's the answer the viewers should leave with. The one that still stands, whether the public narrative is stronger on one side or the other. Iran does not need to fully break Israeli air defense to change the political meaning of the war. It only needs enough surviving capability to keep proving that one launch can still turn into many civilian fears over one defended city after another. That is why this story will linger after the numbers blur. Not because 9 is the biggest number in the war, not because 7 is the biggest barrage of the conflict, but because this sequence revealed something harder to shake. One surviving cluster-capable missile can still buy far more instability than its launch count suggests, and that makes every future lull feel less like peace and more like loading time. Stay here. This channel tracks the moment the headline stops explaining the war, and the war starts explaining the headline.